Hello everyone, and welcome to my second video in my series on how to play chess. Now if you haven't watched my first video, I'll link that in the description. It basically explains the basic rules of chess, how to move the pieces, what the object of the game is, things like that. Today I want to talk about controlling, attacking, and defending. I'm going to make some sample moves here so we can really get into the chess game. Alright now, so there's a very important concept in chess called square control. If you saw my last video, when I click my knight, it highlights all the squares he can move to, and by definition, square control is a square a piece can capture on. So if you look at these squares here, highlighted in blue, those are all squares that my knight controls. Because if an enemy piece were to land there, my knight could capture it. Now you're going to hear the terms controlling, attacking, and defending used interchangeably, but they basically all mean the same thing. The only difference is what piece happens to be on the squares. So the term control applies to empty squares. If you look at this square, this one, and this one, those are all squares my knight controls. And notice how they're all empty. So whenever we talk about empty squares, we're talking about controlling those squares. As you can see, one of the squares my knight controls contains a black pawn, and what we say here is that not only is my knight controlling the square the black pawn is on, he's also attacking the pawn. When you hear the term attacking, it means that if my knight wanted to, on the next turn he could capture that pawn. So in essence, my knight is attacking that pawn. And if you remember how the knight moves, you see that there are no blue circles here where this pawn is, where the king is, and where this pawn is. That's because my knight can't move there on the next turn, because it's occupied by one of my pieces. But just because the blue circles aren't there doesn't mean my knight isn't playing a key role on those squares where my pieces are. So it turns out my knight is actually defending my own piece here. And the definition of defense is if an enemy piece were to capture that piece that the knight is controlling, I would be able to capture back with the knight. So my pawn is said to be defended. Same with this pawn, and we can talk about kings later, but yes, essentially this king is defended. Alright, so let's look at the game from black's perspective. As you can see, it's now black's turn because white's bishop just came from this square to this square. And let's take a look. So if black wants to move his bishop back here, as you can see, the bishop controls all of these squares along this diagonal. So if the bishop wanted to, he can move to any one of those squares. Now if we look at black's other possible moves, we see that our knight is attacking this white pawn here. So if we wanted to, we could go ahead and capture it. But we forgot to look at one thing. So it appears like we skipped something. So we know our black knight is attacking this white pawn, but we didn't notice at first that this white knight is defending this pawn. So what would happen is, if black takes white's pawn, because the pawn was defended, white can just take back, and now we just lost one of our knights. So you can see from black's perspective, this knight taking this pawn was an unsafe move. The reason being, white could just recapture the knight. And what that also means is that this square that the pawn is on was an unsafe square. It was an unsafe square from black's perspective. Oh, and by the way, when we capture something and our opponent captures back, we call that a trade. And I'll talk more about trades later. So let's go through the game and make some moves here. This looks like a safe square because black's pieces, they're not guarding this square or controlling it in any way, so we can just move the pawn up. Okay, so now for black to make a move. Same thing, this square here doesn't look like white is controlling it at all, so we can safely move our pawn there. So now that it's white's move, let's say we wanted to move our bishop to this square. Well, guess what? This square would be an unsafe square because this pawn could capture. And do take note, it isn't the pawn here that is guarding this square because, as you can see, we can't move our pawn there because the bishop's in the way. It would be the pawn next to this pawn right here, that would go ahead and capture the bishop. So to review how the pawn moves, he moves forward, but he captures diagonally. So by the definition of control, our pawn isn't, this pawn here that I've highlighted is not controlling any of the squares in front of it. He can move there, but if any enemy pieces were to move there, then this pawn wouldn't be able to capture it because that's not how he captures. But instead, this pawn controls the square diagonally in front of it, which is where this bishop is. And it controls it because it's able to capture the bishop when the bishop is there. So if you go back here, it doesn't look like this pawn is controlling anything because he can't move to this square here, but that's actually not true. He's still controlling this square even though he can't move there currently, because if an enemy piece were to move there, he could just capture. And just because there isn't an enemy piece here doesn't mean that the pawn here is not controlling this square. So let's play a different move here. Notice that even though our bishop is being attacked by black's bishop, he's also being defended by this white pawn here. So if black were to take this bishop, white could just take back with a pawn. Now let's make a couple more moves here. Knight goes here, that's a safe square. Knight goes here. Let's move our queen out. And let's move this queen over here. So the next thing I want to talk about is threats. So the definition of a threat is when a move is made that attacks an undefended piece. And the way you assess a threat is, say if it was white's turn to move again, he could go ahead and capture this piece. So let's say black made a move here. On white's next move he could just capture the piece, and nothing can take the queen, so white has just won a pawn. So the way you determine that there's a threat on the board is you just pretend that it's your opponent's turn again, and if your opponent can capture a piece for free, then your opponent has made a threat. And it's very important to look for threats in chess, because you never know when your opponent might surprise you. Oh, and by the way, there's a difference between an attack and a threat. So as you can see, this white bishop is attacking this black knight here, but the reason why it's not a threat is because if the bishop were to take the knight, this pawn could take back the knight, and that would be safe for black. And sometimes you can have threats when there aren't attacks, but I'll talk a little bit more about that later in another video. And so when our opponent has made a threat, there are various ways of dealing with the threat. The ways you remember how to deal with a threat are, you remember A, B, C, D, E. So A stands for avoid, avert, or run away, and that's what black can do. He can take his pawn and he can push it so that he's safe and he's defended by these two pawns. That's the A method. The second method is to block. If I had another piece, I could place him on this square here and he would be defended and the pawn would be blocked from an attack. Third way of dealing with a threat is to capture the attacker. So as you can see, the white queen is the attacker. If I could take this bishop and capture the queen, that would be a great way to stop the attack on this pawn. But as you can see, I can't do that because remember, pieces can't jump over other pieces to get where they're going. And the fourth way of dealing with a threat is to defend. So I can move my rook here, and that defends the pawn, because if the queen takes the pawn, the rook can now take back. So this pawn is now defended, whereas before he was undefended. And the fifth way to deal with a threat is everything else. You can counterattack, you can ignore it and create other threats of your own, or you can sacrifice the pawn for something else, but all of that gets really complicated really fast. So I'll save that for another video. Alright guys, thanks for watching my video. Don't forget to comment, like, subscribe, and share this video on your social networks, and I'll see you next time.